Welcome to the 7th video of 7 from the Roman Army 2021 UofW lecture on war strategy and stuff. And this final one, I just want to go over one little example of evidence for war planning. So they did do some planning for war, and we can see that they prepared in advance and so on. And to do this, I'm going to draw on a paper. Okay, I'm going to focus, well, for one thing, I'm going to focus on Trajan's Dacian Wars. Okay, fought in the early 1st century CE. This is not what I want to draw. There we go. And I want to go back to this slide from an earlier video, the same general lecture from Kimberly Kagan, which she said grand strategy is the use of all the state's resources to achieve all the state's major security objectives. And in her essay, journal article, she basically does this, looking at how the Romans use resources by comparing, again, different legions in different places, different times, and how this fluctuated. Now you can actually zoom in, use the same kind of data, the evidence for where legions and auxiliaries were at different times, and building on her point here is the use of all these resources to meet security objectives, and hone in on some conflicts to see how they prepared in advance. These weren't necessarily ad hoc things, that there were, a few years in the making. And this case of Trajan's Dacian Wars is pretty good. So here are just, again, a few details, and there's a sort of more recent sculpture of Decebalus in the rocks, Danube, in Romania. So Domitian, reigning 81 to 96, had a lot of trouble with Dacians and in Moesias in Bulgaria, Danube, etc. There was an earlier king, carried off some raids. There was some loss of an army or two and a governor or two. And then he responded by bolstering the military complement in the region and seemingly seemed to prepare for a major war. But he was assassinated. Nerva, whose successor, was there for around 2 years, maybe a bit less. And then Trajan came, and a few years into his reign, from 98, in 101 to 102, he launched a major offensive against the Dacians, and then again 105 to 106, which effectively ended Dacian independence. So here again is the region. Okay, so here's Moesias in Bulgaria. Here's Dacia up here. So we can use all that evidence we have, where legions were at a given time and where auxiliaries were. And I think I hinted at this when I discussed where these were in an earlier video and lecture. We can look at this and we can see the garrison, approximate garrison. These are all paper strength. So this is based on what we know about the size of a legion auxiliary unit, how many soldiers there would be. I used that information to come up with these totals. And it doesn't mean that they are exact representations of how many soldiers there were at these given times, because we have no precise information on how many people were sick or dead or had deserted, and they maybe hadn't completely filled up the ranks and so on. Nevertheless, so taking these is a reasonable representation of the garrison of this area. We have in 78 CE, so this is before Domitian becomes emperor in 81, but not long before. There were 3 legions in Moesia when it was all one province. Okay, so it was pretty much all of this, more or less. Okay, it was Dacia inside the Danube. 22 auxiliary units, which works out to about 11,448 soldiers, and 3 legions works out to about 15,840 soldiers. Now, we skip ahead, well into Domitian's reign now in 93, and so at this point, this is after the initial problems with the Dacians had come and gone, and we still see the Romans as kind of reactionary. This is one of the points of other scholars, so Mann's sort of review of Luttwak. They were more reactionary, and Luttwak's argument sort of implies some sort of foresight. But and one of the things about Kagan is it doesn't necessarily have to involve all of that. Nevertheless, so if we go to 93, so it looked like Domitian was preparing to, just reinforcing the region. He had divided the province into 2. So what had been one province, roughly here, became Moesia Inferior and Moesia Superior. And in the superior version, Upper Moesia, there were now 2 legions and 11 auxiliary units, works out to 10,560 soldiers and 6,416. Okay. You could look earlier, but some of the changes that we know about, we have some evidence for are harder to document much earlier than that. Okay. If you look at 93 in Moesia Inferior, so Lower Moesia, you see again 2 legions. We know there's 1 more legion than before, and 23 auxiliary units, and 1 more auxiliary unit than in the whole of the 2 provinces before, which works out 10,560 and 11,928. So a big increase in the number of soldiers. He had increased the garrison of the now 2 provinces. And then if you go to 100, okay, so this is at least a year before the war against Dacia under Trajan. So Trajan is now emperor. Okay. Fortunately, from 93 to 100, we can't necessarily pin down to a specific year when many of these units had moved. But we can look at the year 100, and say yes, there had been a big change. And we see that there were now 24 auxiliary units. Look at that big jump. From same number of legions, 2 to 2, but look at the auxiliaries, 1124. From 6,416, which is superior to about 12,776. Again, approximate paper strength. A big jump. It looks superior is the same thing. Okay, same number of legions, slight increase in auxiliaries, 23 to 22. Okay, which results in just over 14,000 soldiers. So, how do we know this is planning for war? Well, this is only, let's say a year, months, whatever it is, before the war started. And it also shows you, one of the things we've talked a little bit about is the difference between legions and auxiliaries. And legionaries were citizens, and auxiliaries are often non-citizens and eventually could become citizens, and later in time they often were citizens. Although legionaries might be paid slightly better, might have slightly better terms of service. The auxiliaries are still quite important. Maybe they were slightly cheaper, but nevertheless, preparing for a major war, who does Trajan bring into the province to bolster its at least offensive military opportunities? It is a buttload of auxiliary soldiers in this one region, which probably also suggests to you that, so the attack, if slight increase here from 93 to 100, big increase of auxiliaries here, from 93 to 100 superior, probably means the attack was coming, this way. Anyway, okay, so big jumps. But you can also see, sort of to highlight the fact that these are sort of wartime specific changes. So some, 40 years later, there were still 2 legions. The auxiliaries had been reduced to almost what it had been before in superior, okay? And over in inferior, 1 more legion, but quite a few less auxiliaries. Really not after the war, and a lot of soldiers were moved into Dacia, some other changes, but basically you can take these numbers, and I think you can see pretty clear evidence that the Romans and Trajan, possibly even earlier under Domitian, were gearing up for war against Dacia, and they were looking to focus specifically from Moesia Superior, go across roughly Serbia into what is today Romania to fight the Dacians, and of course they succeeded. So there you go, the end of the 7th video of the war strategy and so on. I know it's kind of another hodgepodge, scratch the surface, talked a bit about values, what values, underscored Roman approaches to war, looked at strategy, Luftwaffe, anti-Luftwaffe, looked at some frontiers, and looked at the forts and the variety and the similarities, and talked a bit about soldiers being used there to consolidate position, but possibly to launch raids, and here we now see them planning for an individual conflict. So that's it until after read week.